Most men don't realize they're being manipulated because manipulation doesn't look like control. It looks like mixed signals. It looks like emotional highs and lows. It looks like maybe she'll change if I try harder. And that's exactly why it works. If you've ever felt anxious waiting for a reply, guilty for setting boundaries, or exhausted trying to do everything right, this message is for you. Not to blame women, but to wake men up. Because the moment you understand how manipulation works, it stops working on you. Manipulation only works on men who outsource their self-worth, because the moment a man stops defining himself, someone else steps in and does it for him. When a man measures his value through approval, attention, or validation from a woman, he quietly hands over control of his emotional state. His confidence becomes conditional. His mood depends on how he is treated. And once that dependency is established, influence turns into leverage. Manipulation does not require malice or planning. It simply emerges when one person realizes another cannot regulate his own sense of worth. The man may believe he is being patient, understanding, or romantic, but beneath that behavior is fear. Fear of being unwanted, replaced, or unchosen. That fear is the true engine of manipulation. A man who outsources his self-worth constantly looks outward for reassurance. He reads into tone changes, delayed responses, shifting affection, and subtle emotional cues because his inner foundation is unstable. Every interaction becomes a test of whether he is enough. When attention is given, he feels elevated. When it is withdrawn, he feels diminished. This emotional volatility makes him easy to steer. He will tolerate behavior he would normally reject, justify actions that violate his values, and silence his instincts just to preserve access to validation. Manipulation thrives in this space because inconsistency becomes addictive to someone who equates approval with identity. Outsourcing self-worth also creates a dangerous imbalance. The man begins negotiating against himself. He lowers standards without being asked. He over-explains, over-gives, and over-commits in hopes of securing emotional safety. In doing so, he teaches others how to treat him. The more he sacrifices his boundaries to keep someone close, the more power he hands over. Manipulation is rarely about dominance. It is about dependence. The dependent person becomes predictable, and predictability is easy to control. When a man fears loss more than disrespect, he unconsciously accepts emotional pressure as the price of connection. The illusion many men fall into is believing manipulation is something done to them, rather than something enabled by their internal state. They focus on tactics, behaviors, or personalities while ignoring the root cause, the absence of a self-defined identity. A man without internal validation becomes emotionally outsourced, waiting for signals to tell him how to feel about himself. He mistakes intensity for intimacy and confusion for depth because chaos feels meaningful when inner clarity is missing. In this condition, manipulation doesn't feel like control. It feels like hope, anticipation, and emotional investment. When a man builds his self-worth internally, manipulation loses its grip because there is nothing external to take away. Approval no longer determines value, and attention is no longer currency. Emotional withdrawal does not trigger panic because identity remains intact. Boundaries stop feeling like risks and start feeling like necessities. A man who knows his worth does not cling, chase, or negotiate for respect because his sense of self is not up for discussion. He engages by choice, not by fear, and where there is no fear of loss, there is no leverage to exploit. Emotional reactions are the entry point for control because the moment a man reacts instead of responds, he surrenders clarity. Control does not begin with commands or pressure. It begins with emotion overriding reason. When feelings spike, whether through jealousy, fear, excitement, or anxiety, judgment narrows. The mind shifts from observation to urgency, from choice to impulse. In that state, a man becomes easier to guide because he is no longer acting from principles, but from emotional momentum. The more intense the reaction, the less awareness remains, and awareness is the only real defense against being controlled. When emotional reactions become predictable, they become exploitable. If someone knows what triggers insecurity, anger, or longing, they no longer need to force behavior, they can provoke it. A delayed response creates anxiety. A sudden withdrawal creates panic. A small amount of affection after distance feels disproportionately powerful. None of this works on someone who can regulate his emotions internally. It only works on a man whose emotional state is being constantly activated by external cues. Emotional reactivity turns interactions into emotional transactions, where mood is exchanged for compliance. The danger of emotional reactions is that they create a false sense of urgency. A man feels he must act now, explain, confront, fix, impress, because discomfort feels intolerable. This urgency is what collapses boundaries. He says things he would normally withhold. He agrees to things that don't align with him. He chases clarity instead of maintaining self-respect. Control thrives in urgency because urgency short circuits reflection. The more emotional the moment feels, the less likely a man is to pause and evaluate what is actually happening. Emotional reactions also distort perception. When emotions are high, reality becomes selective. A man remembers the highs more vividly than the disrespect. He focuses on potential instead of patterns. He rationalizes behavior that contradicts his values because his emotional attachment demands coherence. This is how manipulation feels invisible. It does not announce itself as control. It feels like emotional connection, vulnerability, and investment. But in truth, the emotional reaction is being used as a steering wheel, directing behavior without resistance. Control becomes effortless when emotional regulation is absent. The reactive man does not need to be told what to do. His emotions do it for him. He withdraws when he should stand firm. He pursues when he should pause. He apologizes when he has done nothing wrong. Each reaction reinforces a dynamic where his emotional stability depends on someone else's behavior. Over time, this conditions him to anticipate emotional shifts and adjust himself accordingly, which is the essence of control. A man who learns to slow his reactions regains power immediately, not through detachment, but through awareness. When emotion arises and he does not act on it instantly, he creates space. In that space, choice returns. Control loses its entry point because the trigger no longer produces automatic movement. Emotional discipline does not mean suppression. It means refusing to let temporary feelings dictate permanent decisions. Where emotions are observed instead of obeyed, influence weakens, leverage disappears, and control has no place to enter. Attention is currency. Whoever invests more loses leverage because attention is not neutral. It signals value, priority, and emotional availability. When one person consistently gives more attention, more energy, more focus, they communicate dependency without saying a word. Attention tells the other person, "You matter more to me than I matter to myself." In any interpersonal dynamic, the person who is less invested retains freedom, while the one who is more invested becomes anxious about loss. This imbalance quietly reshapes the power structure of the relationship, not through dominance, but through asymmetry of emotional commitment. Men often misunderstand attention as effort or affection, believing that giving more will secure connection. In reality, excessive attention reduces perceived value because it removes scarcity. When attention is always available, it becomes taken for granted. The man who overinvests starts adjusting his schedule, his emotions, and his priorities around someone else's availability. His world begins to orbit another person. This is where leverage shifts. The person receiving the attention does not need to demand control. It is already being handed over through availability and focus. The loss of leverage happens because attention creates expectation. The more consistently a man gives his attention, the more it becomes the baseline. Any reduction in it feels like loss to him, but not necessarily to the other person. This asymmetry breeds anxiety. He notices changes in tone, response time, and engagement because he has already invested emotionally. His attention is no longer a choice, it is a habit driven by attachment. At this point, he reacts to shifts instead of setting the pace, which places him in a reactive position. Attention also amplifies emotional risk. The man who invests more has more to lose, so he becomes cautious about asserting boundaries. He avoids conflict. He tolerates ambiguity. He rationalizes behavior that makes him uncomfortable because walking away would mean losing the emotional investment he has already made. This is how attention transforms into leverage. The person who receives it can withdraw slightly and trigger pursuit, or give small amounts and regain influence without ever explicitly asking for anything. What makes attention such a powerful currency is that it is invisible. Unlike money or status, attention feels noble and selfless, which is why men rarely guard it. They give it freely, believing it proves sincerity. But in dynamics of attraction, sincerity without self-regulation turns into imbalance. The man who controls his attention controls the frame of the interaction. He is present without being consumed. He invests without overextending. His attention remains selective, which preserves leverage. Leverage does not come from indifference, but from self-possession. When a man's life is full, purpose, goals, standards, his attention naturally has limits. Those limits create respect. When attention is given from fullness rather than need, it enhances connection instead of weakening position. The moment attention stops being used to fill a void, it stops being a liability and becomes a conscious choice. And whoever is capable of withholding attention without fear retains the upper hand in any emotional exchange. Boundaries are stronger than arguments because arguments seek validation, while boundaries assert reality. An argument invites debate, explanation, and negotiation, all of which keep the power dynamic open and unstable. When a man argues, he is asking to be understood, approved of, or agreed with. In doing so, he places his position on trial. Boundaries, on the other hand, do not ask for permission. They do not attempt to convince. They simply define what is acceptable and what is not, and then they stand still. This is why boundaries create respect, where arguments only create noise. Most men argue when they feel violated because they believe logic will restore fairness. They explain why something hurt them, why a behavior was wrong, why it shouldn't happen again. But explanation assumes the other person shares the same values or priorities. When they don't, the argument becomes an emotional exchange rather than a resolution. The man talks more, reveals more, and becomes increasingly invested in being understood. Each additional explanation weakens his position because it signals uncertainty. Boundaries require no explanation because they are not about agreement. They are about self-definition. Arguments also keep men trapped in reaction mode. When emotions are high, arguing feels like action, but it is often a substitute for enforcement. A man who argues repeatedly about the same issue teaches others that his limits are flexible. Words replace consequences, and without consequences, there is no reason for behavior to change. Boundaries function differently. They are quiet but firm. When crossed, they trigger action rather than discussion. This removes ambiguity and ends the cycle of emotional bargaining. The strength of boundaries lies in consistency. A boundary that is enforced once but abandoned later becomes meaningless. This is why arguments are easier. They allow emotional release without requiring follow through. Boundaries demand discipline. They require a man to tolerate discomfort, silence, and even loss in order to protect his self respect. That willingness to walk away is what gives boundaries their power. When someone realizes a boundary will be upheld regardless of emotional pressure, manipulation loses its leverage. Another reason boundaries outperform arguments is that they preserve dignity. Arguments escalate. They create winners and losers, defensiveness and resentment. Boundaries bypass this entirely. They are not personal attacks, they are personal standards. A man with strong boundaries does not need to prove anyone wrong. He simply removes himself from situations that do not align with him. This calm withdrawal communicates strength far more effectively than raised voices or emotional explanations. Boundaries also clarify dynamics quickly. They reveal who respects you and who benefits from crossing your limits. When a man stops arguing and starts enforcing, behavior either adjusts or the relationship dissolves. Both outcomes are informative. Arguments prolong confusion by keeping hope alive that understanding will change behavior. Boundaries cut through confusion by making expectations non negotiable. A man who relies on boundaries instead of arguments reclaims control over his time, energy, and emotional state. He no longer needs to convince others of his worth or his limits. His actions speak where words once failed. Boundaries shift the focus from what others should do to what he will tolerate. And that shift is what transforms respect from something requested into something automatically given. Confusion is not chemistry, even though many men mistake the two because confusion feels intense, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. Real chemistry feels alive, but it also feels clear. Confusion, by contrast, keeps the nervous system in a constant state of alert, mistaking anxiety for excitement. When someone's behavior is inconsistent, warm one moment, distant the next, the emotional spikes that follow can create the illusion of depth. The mind interprets uncertainty as mystery and mystery as attraction, even when the underlying experience is stress rather than connection. Men often associate emotional intensity with meaning. If something feels calm and stable, they question whether it's real. But when something feels volatile, they assume it must matter more. This is how confusion gets mislabeled as chemistry. The emotional highs feel earned because they come after emotional lows. The relief of affection after distance feels powerful, not because the connection is strong, but because the nervous system has been deprived and then rewarded. This cycle conditions attachment, not intimacy. True chemistry does not require decoding. It does not force a man to analyze messages, read between lines, or constantly wonder where he stands. Confusion demands mental energy. It keeps a man focused on interpretation rather than presence. He becomes preoccupied with what something means instead of how it feels. Over time, this erodes self-trust. When confusion is persistent, a man begins doubting his instincts, accepting ambiguity as normal, and suppressing discomfort to preserve access to the emotional highs. Confusion also shifts responsibility inward. Instead of questioning inconsistent behavior, a man questions himself. He wonders if he said the wrong thing, moved too fast, or failed to meet unspoken expectations. This internalization deepens attachment because he believes clarity is something he must earn. Chemistry, on the other hand, does not need to be earned through self-erasure. It flows naturally when interest is mutual and communication is aligned. Another danger of mistaking confusion for chemistry is that it normalizes emotional instability. A man starts believing that uncertainty is part of attraction, that longing requires distance, and that emotional safety is boring. This belief keeps him chasing dynamics that keep him off balance. Real chemistry supports expansion, not contraction. It allows a man to feel grounded rather than anxious, confident rather than vigilant. When confusion dominates a connection, it often means one person is controlling the emotional temperature while the other adapts. The adaptive one calls it chemistry because admitting confusion would require confronting imbalance. Chemistry does not require constant adjustment. It does not punish consistency or reward emotional withdrawal. It grows through mutual effort and clarity. A man who learns to distinguish confusion from chemistry regains emotional clarity. He stops romanticizing uncertainty and starts valuing alignment. He understands that attraction that costs peace is not attraction, and that a connection that requires constant interpretation is not connection at all. Chemistry does not leave a man questioning his worth, replaying conversations, or feeling destabilized by silence. And where clarity is absent, intensity is often just emotional noise masquerading as depth. Indifference is power, not coldness, because indifference does not mean a lack of feeling. It means a refusal to be controlled by feeling. Coldness is emotional shutdown, often rooted in fear or resentment. Indifference is emotional self regulation. A man who is indifferent is not numb. He is grounded. He experiences emotions without being driven by them. This distinction is critical because power is not the absence of emotion, but mastery over it. Where coldness pushes people away defensively, indifference simply removes leverage. Most men fear indifference because they confuse it with apathy or cruelty. They believe caring less makes them less human. In reality, indifference is selective caring. It is the ability to remain calm when outcomes are uncertain and to remain steady when attention fluctuates. This steadiness disrupts manipulation because manipulation depends on emotional volatility. When reactions disappear, influence weakens. The man who cannot be provoked, rushed, or emotionally pulled off center becomes difficult to control. Indifference also restores balance in dynamics where emotions have become lopsided. The man who overcares starts negotiating his self-respect for reassurance. Indifference interrupts this pattern. It stops the constant need to explain, chase, or fix. Not because the man doesn't care, but because he no longer needs emotional reciprocity to feel whole. This inner completeness shifts the dynamic immediately. Attention becomes optional rather than necessary. And when attention is optional, it loses its power as a tool of control. What makes indifference powerful is that it removes urgency. Urgency is what drives poor decisions. Urgency makes men tolerate disrespect, ignore patterns, and override intuition. Indifference slows everything down. It allows a man to observe behavior without immediately reacting to it. In that space, clarity returns. He no longer needs to win affection or secure certainty in the moment. He is comfortable with ambiguity because his identity is not on the line. Indifference is often misunderstood as emotional distance, but true indifference is not distance, it is neutrality. A man can be present, engaged, and respectful while remaining indifferent to outcomes that do not align with his standards. He does not threaten, withdraw dramatically, or seek to punish. He simply does not attach his sense of self to another person's behavior. This quiet detachment communicates strength more loudly than any confrontation ever could. When a man practices indifference, he stops feeding dynamics that rely on emotional reward and punishment. Hot and cold behavior loses its effect. Emotional testing falls flat. Attempts to provoke insecurity fail. This does not make him unfeeling, it makes him unmovable. His calm becomes a boundary that does not need to be announced. Others feel it intuitively and adjust accordingly. Indifference shifts a man from reaction to choice. He no longer operates from fear of loss, but from alignment with his values. His responses become measured, his boundaries consistent, and his presence stable. Where coldness creates walls, indifference creates clarity, and clarity is what allows a man to engage deeply without surrendering control over his emotions or his direction. This entire message comes down to one central truth. Power in relationships is never about control over others, it is about control over yourself. Manipulation only survives where self-worth is outsourced, emotions are unchecked, attention is overinvested, boundaries are debated, confusion is romanticized, and reactions are automatic. When a man regains ownership of these internal levers, the external dynamic changes without force, confrontation, or performance. He stops trying to manage outcomes and starts managing himself, and that shift alone dismantles every unhealthy pattern discussed. A grounded man does not need to prove, chase, argue, decode, or emotionally perform.